Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns of your favorite games. I'm Paul Solomon.
And I'm Brendan Hansen.
And I'm Pete Wissinger.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games. Today we're talking about player count. How many players can play your games? And as we design and develop games, this can actually present a lot of complicated work for developers and designers. A game can feel dramatically different at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players. How do you decide the right player count? And can you make a solo game or not? We've got a lot to dig into today, and thanks for coming along for the ride.
I also want to give a little bit of a shout out to, and he's not saying this, I'm saying this, to Paul, congratulating him that his first round of games from the company that he's creative director of, Gamehead, are now for sale, which is really awesome. And now I'll plug myself. I did development on one of them and had an article last week on Board Game Geek News that I'll put a link to in the show notes so people can read about game development a little bit, and kind of you'll be able to see in that article kind of what distinguishes game development from game design.
Say the name.
The game is called No Loose Ends, which is a trick-taking game by the master of trick-taking, Taiki Shinzawa.
And I have a feeling we'll get into some games we've worked on today, including perhaps that one and why things feel a little different at 2, 3, 4, 5, etc.
I'm really excited for this episode, Paul, because in some ways, I think we've done, well, obviously we have our thing that we often do, which is sort of like board game criticism. And then we have the thing we do sometimes, which is talk about board game design. And then we have the thing we've maybe done once before, which is talk about development. And I think that's really in some ways what this episode is going to be about, right? It's sort of a game exists in some form. Now it's come to a publisher, and the publisher says, yeah, that's awesome, I want it to exist. But how should it exist? What does it existing look like? Or maybe, it's late in the design stage and you're sort of like, I love this game at 2. Could I make it work for 5? Should I make it work for 5? What about, can I play it by myself? So that's kind of how, what, where. Yeah?
Yeah, and I will say player count stuff can be really important to designers' concepts for games. For example, Stonemaier games, I believe all of their games have to accommodate 5 players, and it is standard for all of their games to have a solo mode. So even for like an I Cut You Choose game like Stamp Swap, they found a way with Automa Factory to make that work fairly simply. And for Gamehead, for example, we have a party line, and what we've said typically is those need to accommodate 8 players. So these decisions can become really important.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you all play games with anyone who thinks like this, but sometimes if people are looking to play a game or look to play it, especially for the first time, they'll go to Board Game Geek and look at the recommended player counts, because on Board Game Geek, you can rate how good you think a game is at different player counts. And some people really take that poll into consideration when they're playing a game. I don't know if you all have ever taken a look at that or paid attention to that when you're playing games.
I've certainly seen those. I don't think I don't take a lot of stock in it. Though I've seen, you hear this all the time, and I think reviews and also ratings on BGG of just like, I would never play this at 5, or it doesn't work well at 2. And sometimes that happens for different reasons, but it's the kind of critique that shows up a lot in the modern discussion and narrative around game design.
I feel like if you take what's on the box and you take what's on BGG, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Typically, I find. Because BGG often is the most pedantic version of like, this is the most optimal. And what's on the box is typically the broadest to cast a wide marketing net, right? And a huge part of what we're talking about, what we'll get into at some point today too, is the publication decision of, do you put something on the box that you know isn't the optimal experience because you feel it will help the game in the long run? Like, you wouldn't put it there if you think it's a horrible experience, I don't think. But where is that line? How do you find what that line is? What's your appetite for that? Is there any way to position higher player counts? These are the kind of things we'll sort of gnash on, I think.
And I think you're right. What you put on a box is a big kind of complex and like you said, odd marketing choice.
Yeah.
Um, you know, putting just two on a box and saying this is a two-player game. Um, there's a lot of publishers that just don't want to publish two-player games, but you're saying this is a very specific kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I believe my understanding is that most plays of games are two-player plays of games. And so this becomes really important. Now, obviously, most party games do not at all accommodate two players. One hilarious and notable example that kind of tries at this is Werewords. Have you all played Werewords?
No, and I've certainly
No.
never played it at 2.
Right. Okay. So Werewords, for those that don't know, is very much insider from Oink Games. It is 20 questions with a hidden traitor and potentially a seer that knows the word but doesn't want to be found out, things like that. And at two players, there's a secret word that the mayor, one of the players, knows, and the other player ostensibly has to guess. But the way this works is there's a hidden role. There's like I don't even remember exactly how it works. There's a possible werewolf, there's a villager, there's the seer, and the whole game is not about guessing, it's more about identifying their role. And so there'll be times when you both know the word, and for 4 minutes, you just play out this funky, weird thing. And often, this is a good example of how often a two-player version of a game will feel pretty darn different as a play experience, but still, I think, can capture some piece of what the game is doing.
Yeah.
So I would like to start. Maybe can we start by talking about games that do not scale at player counts? Maybe some examples of those games and why those games specifically only say you can only play this with this player count.
And I'll just add, like, to sort of broaden it maybe so we're a little there's obviously some games that are designed as two, but also just like what are the general issues that show up as you try to accommodate different player counts? Obviously, there's a whole huge range of just two player head to head games, dueling games like Star Realms or well, Seven Wonders Duel. Of course, we have all of these duel style games, which are spin-offs of other games. Magic the Gathering, while it can accommodate lots of players, is intended to be two players. Compile, Caper Europe, etc.
So, Brendan, I would like to ask you because you have designed a two-player game. You made Unrest. Was it from its conception always going to be a two-player game? And why did you make that choice?
Yeah. I often will start designs thinking about how to play like, my designs often start as two-player experiences because I find they're easier to play test at 2 players for sort of mechanically prototyping something really simple, and then I'll expand from there if I think the mechanisms will suit expanding beyond 2 players. So Unrest, I started at 2, and I intended to be a two-player game from the very beginning, and part of that was because of the asymmetry. It's really a conversation between 2 players. Unrest is a deduction type game for one side and sort of not really set collection, but this sort of how do you a goal pursuit card game where you're trying to get certain cards into certain areas, but you don't have a lot of agency over them, where you're referencing shared goals that inform what the other side is doing, right? So public plans, private objectives in some way. Not really, but that's kind of the gist, right? And there was a point in that design process, Pete, where I said, could I make this a 3-player game? Could I make it a 4-player game? And I sort of messed around with, okay, what would it look like if there's five areas, these 5 different parts of the city that the rebel player is trying to overthrow, the empire player is trying to stop them from overthrowing them. What if I made the city bigger? What if I added more cards? And I quickly realized it just diluted the experience that I wanted, which was the sort of head-to-head trying to get inside what the other player is wanting to do, and then for the rebel player trying to sort of play the donkey space game of I think they think I'm doing this, so I'm going to do that. So Unrest was always going to be a 2-player game, but I think importantly, a lot of 2-player games are 2 players because of the zero sum nature that's there, or some variance in trying to expand it further would create unfairness that wouldn't be palatable by the players. So, for example, Seven Wonders Duel, I think, is a duel game because Seven Wonders exists to accommodate 2 to 7 players. So it doesn't need to accommodate more. But I think the design itself, a lot of decisions were made that pushes it to the point where even if you tried to force something onto that system, the back and forth nature of drafting cards from these different pyramids, I think, is more fair. It would feel weird having a back and forth draft if you only got to pick once every 4 times rather than every other time.
Yep, and you've hit on something that I think is really important, which is that we alternate turns.
Mhm.
Um, this is crucial for a game like chess, right? I want to do a series of things, but I only get to move one at a time, and you get to go in between, and that's really important. Over the last 2 out of 3 weeks, and the next three, I've been doing a board game day camp for like I guess it's like second graders up to going to be sixth graders. And we played Santorini, which I think is an
Mhm.
excellent, very cool, abstract, um, I don't even know what game, two-player game, stacking, climbing, whatever, spatial. But it does in the box accommodate 3 players. And when I've taught the game to them, I teach it as a 3-player game, but it is dramatically better at 2 players because of the back and forth of sort of like
Mhm.
I create a situation in which I'm going to win and you are the only player responsible for stopping me, and in your next turn you need to make it happen. And that tension gets diluted when there's a third player in between. And sometimes there's an interesting alternate dynamic like, well, I'm not going to do it and I'm going to force you to do it, and there's things like that. But in general, the back and forth of these games makes, if that's important to the game, and it's probably important that it stays 2 players.
Another example is some games that require partnerships. So games that are 2 versus 2 are going to be inflexible in player count because the whole game is built around 2 people working on a team against 2 other people. So an example of this would be something like Tichu, which is a ladder climbing game. And in Tichu, you get points based on when the first person goes out and also based on like when their partner goes out. And so that dynamic as a core element of the game literally just would not work at any other player count. And I think that, almost a 2 versus 2 team game is simulating a similar dynamic to what we're describing with a 2-player game, where it's this zero sum, almost side versus side kind of thing, but with one extra dynamic added.
Mm. You're making me think of Codenames there as you talk about teams.
Yeah.
I don't know what the box says, but Codenames is kind of minimum 4 players because you've got 2 teams with different roles on those teams. Of course, it accommodates lots of additional. But I'm wondering about like, could that be a team versus team game where you have 3 teams and they're not alternating turns and there's more words out there? I mean, you can just imagine the way that it would have a very, very different feel, and that game is built on this back and forth in a shared space.
And I think Codenames has a 2-player variant in the original box. There's also Codenames Duet as a
Yeah.
Mhm.
follow-up, but I believe that there is a 2-player version in that original box, which is hard to believe in some ways because the way Codenames exists now, knowing the massive success that it's had, is not because there's a 2-player variant in the box that allows you to play it that way. But before Codenames was published, before it became the mega hit that it was, there were publication decisions that said, okay, I think we better make this party game work at 2 players, and led to them developing a 2-player version of that game when it's, I think, better suited to have teams playing against each other. So that's sort of our episode is trying to exist in that conversation that they had.
Yeah, and Codenames Duet actually is excellent with 2 players. It's actually a really good 2-player word game. Um, but I would never even consider playing the original Codenames. I didn't
Yeah.
even know there was a 2-player version in the box. Paul, you're historically a big Star Realms player. Does that work with more than 2 players?
Interestingly, the original Star Realms publication decision was to, and it was informed by Magic, because the creators are two Magic the Gathering Hall of Famers, was to release a core set of Star Realms, and says in the rules, if some buddies buy another set, you can play 4 players. And they describe multiple scenarios like a free for all or something called Hunter, where you basically can only attack the person on your left,
Hmm.
and sort of some interesting stuff. And then also they have team based play. There's one called Emperor, I think, where a central player has some additional benefits and they're the one you have to kill, but then there's some assistance on the side, and these things can basically be fun. Um, One thing that they can do is accommodate this back and forth thing where a team takes a turn and then the other team takes a turn. So that can sort of happen. But in general, these are odd variants of, you know, a great dueling game. And I think it's built that way and probably works best that way. But Magic the Gathering, I think, is another weird example because clearly Richard Garfield designed it as a two-player dueling card game, a magical duel. But I think maybe the most common way it's played right now is sort of this four-player commander, everybody smacking each other version of the game, which I think is very different and sort of odd that that's the one that became popular. Sort of like how you described having a two-player thing in the Codenames rules, but that's not at all the game that's popular.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there's a lot of Commander is a real wrench in this whole conversation in some ways, and I think I almost want to just pluck it out of the conversation and throw across the room because I think Commander almost, if I have to speculate before we move on, comes out of the need of there being an odd number of people who show up at a board game store to play Magic and not wanting to leave the third person out or not wanting to leave the fifth person hanging.
Mhm.
So you get this sort of multiplayer game. Whereas if maybe we were playing board games, we just find a game that's best at the number of players that we have. Oftentimes it's 2 because people are playing games at home or whatever, but maybe you want a 4-player game, it's better to go to something like Root.
I also want to note before we move on to scaling player count that another category of games that often has rigid player counts is historical war games.
Mm, yeah.
Because they're setting up a specific type of simulation where you need specific actors in the game for the simulation to work. I'm just looking at there's an example is a game that was on Kickstarter, I think 2 years ago called Weimar, about the history of the Weimar Republic in Germany, designed by Matthias Kramer, and it plays
Oh, wow.
exactly 4 players, and it takes 2 to 4 hours to play.
Diplomacy famously is really a 7-player game only,
Mm.
and you can play it at 6 if you take out Austria-Hungary, and then you can play it at 5 if you take out Italy, but the game is built around 7 players interacting in this historical way because these were sort of the power players at the time.
I, for one, would love to play as Canada in the United States Civil War game.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So
Okay,
should
should we
we
talk
Yeah, I
about
was like,
what makes games Oh, no, we did it again, Pete.
it's fine. I'm the editor. I can cut this out.
So should we talk about what makes games flexible for various player counts, right? Because I think all of the tension in the world exists outside of the games themselves for games to be accommodating of 1 to 200 players would be the ideal, or at least 100.
I think we've all been in a situation where you think you're going to play a game at game night, and then either one more person that you weren't expecting shows up, or one person drops out. And you kind of have to think, are we still going to be able to play the game we planned on playing
Mhm.
now that we have a different number of players? And so,
Yeah.
what are sort of the things that make games play well from, say, 2 to 5 or whatever?
I'm going to sort of pitch this maybe in the contrary. It's hard for me to separate this, but I think about the design difficulties and the challenges. And so we've all been in that situation you described of like, well, somebody left. Why is that a problem? Well, I have to reset the deck now, or like, I mean, it's just, for whatever reason. So as we talk about this, I'm thinking about where the problems show up for playing with more players. And these will run in parallel and counterpoint to some of the things in our list here. But like, for example, if your game has let's just say some amount of downtime, let alone substantial downtime, with parallel play, then the more players you add, the more time there is between turns, and this can be sort of destructive to the play experience you want, right?
Yeah, something like T-call, where you're not making any simultaneous choices. It's literally we're like chess. You use this example, Paul. I'm going to take my turn. You're going to take your turn. Then Pete's going to take his turn. Then Jake's going to take his turn. And the board state is changing a lot from turn to turn. So I can't even do much planning because there's going to be 30 actions that happen from my turn in between my turn and my next turn. That's going to slow a game down immensely. It works. It works quite well. T-call is great at 4, but it's very long. And I think that's one of the things that can make games less flexible at higher player counts is these long turns, right? If there's no mechanism for players to be doing something between plays, it's going to feel like a slog. So I think a good, nice solution for something like that is something like a Feast for Odin, how Ue lets you puzzle out on your board how you want to arrange things in between your turns, sort of before you lock it in. It just gives you a personal thing to be doing to at least occupy that.
Yeah, I think that sort of a big design sensibility that I think has become more and more embraced is the idea of having quick, snappy turns in your games. Like instead of having a turn where someone does 4 things, have them just do one thing, and then it'll just come around that much more. And those types of games tend to have better flexibility when it comes to player count.
Yep. I think Jake's talked about this a lot, and I think he uses the term micro turns almost like in a derogatory way. I think he looks down on that a little bit. But I think what makes a great game like Ethnos work so well for, I would say, probably 2 to 7 players is the fact that these turns are so fast. Draw a card, draw a card, draw a card, play a set of cards, and put a piece on the board. And, you know, even though there's some amount of board state change, it's not so dramatic that the 6 turns that, come before your next one really destroy your ability to take the next turn in a pretty snappy way.
A designer who comes to mind for me where this just feels like such a feature of his catalog, but interestingly, I think he also doesn't make a lot of games for more than 4 players, is Reiner Knizia. There are definitely examples of games in his catalog that accommodate up to 4, but I think he's hyper aware of the player experience and typically likes these shorter, just bite-sized turns. Does something like Blue Lagoon or Babylonia, but Babylonia is actually even pushing for his catalog. Blue Lagoon's the better example, where he's really cognizant of how long is it going to be before a player has a turn again? What can I do to make it such that players are acting at the same time? Something like My City. Modern art is another good example that we can mention that solves this problem, right? Because modern art, everyone's sort of involved in every turn of the game. That's another way that games can solve for having scalable player accounts. You don't have turns. Every time there's an action taken, all players have an input on what we're looking at. Trick taking games or climbing games often have something similar, right? An atom of the game, everyone has something to say in that. So in trick taking, it's a trick. We're all going to contribute a card. Then we see what happens. In auction games like modern art, everyone likely will have an input either, but at least in saying maybe I don't want to be involved, but at least you had to make a decision to say you weren't going to be involved. So that's another thing that can really help, right? Is just not having turns. It's a game that accommodates some other form of play, or having short turns, or having turns where everyone is involved in one way or the other.
Yeah, I think we've seen a couple of big hits in the Euro game space lately, toying with simultaneous turns,
Mm.
where it is a parallel play game with low interaction, but it enables everyone to basically take their turns at once. So if you take something like Fromage, you have this board that Paul and I deep dived. You have this board that rotates, and you're just playing on the piece of the board that's in front of you, but everyone is doing that at the same time. Or a game like Earth, where maybe one person is taking an action, but then everyone gets to take follow actions. So there's literally no downtime, no matter what player count you're playing with.
Yeah, the Planet Unknown draft comes to mind for something similar to that, where there's this really nice sort of rotating piece in the middle that contains all the pieces. So whomever it's their active turn, they get to choose sort of where to spin this disc. And then they pick from the segment of that disc in front of them, but that also puts a segment of that disc in front of every other player at the table. So they can make a drafting decision from that wedge at the same time. And then you can all place them at the same time. So it truly is simultaneous play, but everyone's making a different decision at the same time, which I think is a nice solution, because some games accomplish this, have these sort of low interaction games with simultaneous play. The thing that comes to mind for me when you say those two things is roll and write games, right? Roll and write games are really flexible in player count typically, because oftentimes you don't have much interaction outside of maybe caring about some shared goals where it's a race to achieve those goals and you're going to get a payout for being the first one to get there. So it's maybe the only point of interaction, something like Welcome to or Trails of Tucana or Cartographers, things like this. Those games are fairly easy to scale because you're mostly worried about your little puzzle in front of you on your sheet of paper.
Right. And Pete famously does not much care for these games that are these roll and write games that are like, if it says 1 to 100 on the box, I think it's almost certainly going to be a roll and write game. First class letters is this way. And the fun of the player interaction is just at the end of the round, you say, well, here was my word. Oh, that was a good word, etc. I was wondering just there if there are any huge player count games like that that do allow for some amount of interactivity. And I think Two Rooms and a Boom came to my mind. Not that I've ever played it, but I think this plays a huge amount of players in this sort of social deduction thing, moving between two rooms. Are there other big, huge player count games that work well without sort of being totally separated?
Like a mega game kind of thing?
I guess, yeah, there are like those mega huge simulation games. Right. But they're not exactly flexible on player
Um,
count necessarily. They rely on having a lot of them.
Blood on
Yeah.
the Clock Tower says it plays from 6 to 21.
Yeah. That's a pretty big
Yeah.
range there.
That's very, and I mean, we're like, oh, you need at least 6. That's so many. But like
Yeah.
the upper end of that is
Very
wild.
high. Yeah.
Apparently, BGG says 9 to 12 is the best player count for Blood on the Clock Tower.
Interesting.
Yeah,
What's the
immediately.
time length on that?
Yeah.
30 minutes to 2 hours.
Okay, here's what I wanted to say about that is I think it's you talked about how micro turns are becoming increasingly popular, and I think that's true. That's a true trend for the hobby and the sort of wide market. But something else I've noticed on the Euro side, let's say, is including things like 15 minutes per player or
Mhm.
30 minutes per player. And this is pretty common of Brian Surrey's designs, for example. Um, Even when they're fairly interactive, they're sort of set up where like each player's taken 20 turns. And
Mm.
that means that the game will just grow and extend. Um, some designers, some developers may feel comfortable with that and are happy to put that on the box. But when I work on games, typically I don't want that to be true. And I want the experience at different player counts to be kind of close and similar. And so I look for ways to adjust the way that that works, so that the game is closer to the same overall game length across player counts.
So if we look at that time per player maybe being a little bit of a red flag in terms of scalability in a game, it makes me think of, I don't think this is the time they put on the box, but I think a game like Wingspan is like that, where the more people you play Wingspan with, just the longer it's going to take to play Wingspan, because you get the same number of turns every time you play Wingspan, no matter how many people you're playing with. So I think for some people, they see Wingspan as basically like a 2 to 3 person game because they don't want the game to just go longer for the same amount of gameplay.
And one of the reasons for that, right, is in Wingspan, everyone's mostly working on their own puzzle, and there's interactivity in Wingspan, but you're sort of if you're playing at 2 players versus playing at 4 players, your interaction and your gameplay, your goals are still fairly similar. And I think that that's in part because of the components at play and where those component live on the table. And I think these are fuzzy topics that will be hard to get super specific about, but really important for the conversation of, are games inherently flexible? Should we try to push this? All of a sudden, questions come up immediately. Like, if there's cards at play, does it matter how many cards there are per player per whatever the things are in the deck? If you try to push a game to 5, are players going to have enough of a certain suit to do what they need to be doing with it? Is there a shared board? Does it matter that the spaces scale or not on that shared board? In Babylonia, absolutely would. It would ruin the game if you tried to play a 2-player game on the 4-player map of Babylonia. So that game has this really neat sort of system where you use different parts of the board in different combinations based on the number of players that are there. But I think you can keep doing this too, just with different types of components. The reason why roll and write games work is because everyone gets one little sheet and a pencil in front of them, and that's the whole game, right? It's affordable to scale something like that. Just one works because everyone just needs an easel and a little writing pen. But if you have to, all games could be playable by more, sometimes aren't, just because it's a publishing constraint. You just can't fit the things in the box to make it
That's
play
right.
great.
Yep. And there are you mentioned you just sort of touched on a really uh big sort of deep area of adjusting for player count about components. But first of all, you're exactly right that sometimes it's just a cost analysis. So
Yeah.
for a long time in the Honey Buzz development, it was a 5-player game, and I think we went to 4 players. Just because it would be another 10 wooden beeples and another player board and another additional tiles and etc, and all that cost illustration, not just printing costs. But even before that, in playtesting, we were playing it at 6 players. And I would not play Honey Buzz at this time now with 6 players, only because I've learned that there are people taking 3 minutes per turn out there in the world. And the people I was playtesting with did not do that. Um, just to carry on with Honey Buzz for a second, one of the main ways that we adjusted for player count is in the nectar field,
Mm.
where players indirectly compete to gather the types of nectars that they'll need to produce types of honey. And when the nectar's gone, it's gone, and so you have a bit of a race to certain resources. And um, at 4 players, I believe there's 6 of each honey type out there. So players can have on average 1.5 of all of them. And then we basically reduce that down by 1 set per player count. So down at 2 players, there's only 4. Now that if you make a decision like that, you're adding to setup time,
Yeah.
and that's a consideration as a developer. Is it worth it there? Then there's also, how many tiles per player they get, and how does this impact game length? So yeah, there's talking about components is huge, and I'm sure Pete has things to tell us about, like how you set up a trick taking deck for different player counts. I mean, this is a big deal, right? And I think you're muted here for the moment, Pete.
Thank you. Um, yeah, great. Good thing I'm the editor again. So when it comes to card games and trick taking games, there's a couple of issues that come in when it comes to player scaling. One is how many tricks are there to go around? Because especially if it's a game where you need people to win a certain number of tricks, or you're incentivizing how many tricks you win, or whatever, that becomes a little bit of an issue. And then, are there enough cards in each suit so that people are not short suited? There's all kinds of different issues with that. Um, to get a little bit into a game that I made, I designed a game called Crits and Tricks, which is a trick taking game that uses polyhedral dice as the numbers on your cards. Your cards don't have numbers, but you have a full set of like role playing game dice that you use. And that was always going to be a 6 trick game because you have 6 dice. You have a D4, you have a D6, a D8, a D10, a D12, and a D20. So there are 6 different sizes of polyhedral dice that are used in a role playing game. And so there's always going to be a 6 trick game. You're going to use each of your dice once. And my publisher, Inside Up Games, were like, it really would be better if it played up to 5 or 6 players. And I'm like, well, there's only 6 tricks. And if the game has different goals for players to try to achieve to win tricks in particular ways. It's like if you have 5 players and there's only 6 tricks and you're telling them to try and achieve 3 goals a piece, there's just literally not enough tricks to go around to make that happen. And so I kind of fought to cap that at 4, even though I have worked on a higher player count variant for a future expansion if that happens. But I think that this is why you get some games that when they scale down to 2 or up above a certain level, that the game tends to include variants that change the game in some way. And in trick taking games, often if you're playing with fewer than the maximum player count, you'll remove numbers or suits so that you get the proper distribution of numbers no matter the player count.
I have an interesting trick taking case study here. Um, and we don't talk about our games to sort of push them up to you, but just that's our experience. I worked on a trick taking game called Lobby Snacks, which is a bit like High Society as a trick taking game. Think of each trick as an auction, and whoever wins it has essentially spent money to win the thing. And the hook in the game is that whoever spends the most money winning tricks doesn't score any points. So the cards, just get into the specifics. The cards are value 1, 2, or 3, with the high value cards being 3. So it's easy to win with those, but they're costing you more money, which means you might bust. When we go down, and I should say a bit more here. In a trick with 5 players, we all play a card, and there's a prize card. And the winner of the trick gets all of those cards, which will have a high amount of value. And then their own card is what they spent. So the cards they get are points. And then when you play with 2 or 3 players, there's dramatically less value in the tricks themselves as points that you score. And what we did to sort of patch this up, one, you have to reduce the size of the deck just so that you have some card counting ability, some like lower variance randomness on what could they have, what do they have. You do that. But what we decided to do is take out the low numbers so that the higher value cards are in the tricks more. So when you play with 5 players, you might have a lot of 1 value cards, but in a 2-player game, they're going to be 2s and 3s. And this was something that Taylor Reiner developed. He was the developer on the game. And I thought it was such a brilliant tweak because typically they will cut down to where you have like, well, now it's just 1 to 8 instead of 1 to 12. And making that change really solved the problem of like consistent value in these player count tricks. It was very cool.
I think that that's a really great story to segue into how do you do this? How do you develop a game to be good at multiple player counts? So I think a lot of what happens here, in my mind, when I'm designing a game, is the evaluation. One of sort of there's the question of the aesthetic experience or whatever, right? Like Unrest was just that game was made to be a 2-player head-to-head game, but then for other games I designed, like Enchanted Plumes, instantly math becomes your best friend, and it's fairly simple math, right? What's the thing you care about? Paul, with your example, the nectar and honey buzz, you care about the nectar. How much of that thing do you have per player? And if that nectar is the key, how many locks does the player have and how many keys do they need to unlock it? And almost every game is going to have some sort of piece that you're trying to get and to put in something else. And those are the games that can struggle with scaling for player count without adjustment. So Enchanted Plumes is a card game that I designed that's all about sort of collecting and laying out these plumes of cards. And the number of cards you have per player really matters because it affects how flexible what your decisions are going to be in the game. It affects the game time, all of these things. So for that game, I had to add values into each suit. There's 10 suits in the game based on the number of players that are there to have a game that felt fairly consistent from player count to player count, and just do some assessment of this is probably close enough. I feel okay with it being pushed to this player count. Adding in this, it's not going to change the design too much. But I think in general, that's a really good place to start. And it's also a good way to figure out, is the game going to feel fairly similar or not, right? In the Nectar experience, if I have roughly 2 per player at 2 players and roughly 1.5 per player at 4 players, that's fairly similar. If I have access to 12 at 2 players and 4 at 4 players, that's going to feel like a wildly different game.
Yeah, and this similar to what you're saying shows up a ton in worker placement games. We
Yeah.
want worker placement to be tight. So, do I give people more workers so that they clash, or do I shrink down the size of the worker spaces? So, viticulture has a very natural scaling of player count worker spaces that's elegantly put in there. Honeybuzz shrinks the board by one. Just since you asked the question of like how, I'm going to say that one of the first things that's important to me for player count is game length. And I want game lengths to be consistent. So, one of the little tricks, I guess, of the trade is like a countdown timer. And this is what I used in well, in the base game of Honey Buzz, there are stacks of cards that when they're gone, the game ends, and you shrink the size of those decks to make it happen faster or slower at different player counts. Or these time tracks, these price tracks, you just start them a little lower. But the new end game trigger is this sunset board, and when various events in the game happen, this is empty or these are gone, etc. It advances that forward. Um, you can really easily just have different starting and ending places for that, token on that track to arrive at the end game without having to even change necessarily component counts. You can just say, how
Yeah.
many times did a certain thing happen? And that's going to tell us when the game is over. So there are little tricks of the trade, I guess, that can work around these things.
So there, the key in the lock is the number of turns per player or the number of X per player. It doesn't have to do with components, but it's how many shots at this thing do you have or something. I think that's a great way to think about it too. How many turns should a player have in this game? Can I make that
Yeah,
happen?
and there's
Yeah,
ways to make it a little less rigid still, right? You don't have to say everybody gets 8 turns and then it's
sure.
over. You can have these sort of a little more amorphous end games still at all player counts.
Yeah.
One thing I think that will make games feel different at different player counts is games that need a certain type of tight interaction in order
Mm,
for them to really function. One example of this is Terra Mystica. So in Terra Mystica, you get bonuses for building next to other players. What Age of Innovation did, which I really loved, is that they put a board on the back so you can flip the board over, and it's a player board that's specifically for 2 or 3 players, and then the other side has a board for 4 to 5 players. And because that is ensuring that you're going to be adjacent to each other and you're not playing this weird game where no one's built next to each other, so you're not getting those bonuses. Another thing that'll happen sometimes is if games require, like a worker placement game that requires a certain amount of tightness to the action selection. As I think about Dune Imperium, which if you play Dune Imperium with 2 players, you have to have a dummy player in taking up spaces to block you from going, which clearly means that really in my mind, this game should not be played with 2 players. Like it's just a strictly inferior experience to play Dune Imperium with 2 rather than 3 or 4. However, I'm also aware that putting that player count on a box to say, here's this awesome game people love, and you can't play it with 2 players from a marketing perspective is a no-no. And I suppose playing it with 2 players, if that's all you have, is better than never playing Dune Imperium. So I guess that's a consideration.
I'll push back just a little bit on the idea that if there's a dummy player variant at 2 that it's strictly inferior. I think it makes sense that it's built as a 3-player game and they made a variant, or you might even call it a patch up at 2. But the question of whether it's inferior just depends on the sort of how high quality or how efficient or successful is that dummy player at doing its job. And I've certainly had versions of that I think are very simple and successful. And I'm working on a game called Watches and Clocks. It was a whole thing between me and the designer trying to balance this for player count. I could spend easily 45 minutes to an hour talking about just that game as a case study. But we did use a dummy third player, and they simply move forward and do some of the core pieces of the interaction that we needed them to do, like give people a resource that they needed by landing on them, or by allowing additional following interactions. And so you can sometimes do these things very simply to retain all the things that you want. We did the same thing in Trinket Trove with a very simple third player dummy that does reliable things. Almost like a Robotrick, which is a strictly 4-player or 3-player, I guess you would say. Well, I would call it a 4-player game, but it's one of them's not a human.
Yeah. I was going to talk about that game because Robotrick, Brendan, if you've never played it, is this 3-player only trick taking game where there is a 4th player that is a robot whose hand is face up that acts based on a flow chart. And so players kind of understand how this robot is going to play, and it simulates a 4th player. But you have to play it with 3 players. I suppose you could I wonder if you could put 2 robots in.
Right.
This game
Yes, and you
screams to me
can,
my
certainly.
playtest group has 3 people in it.
It's
Right.
a brilliant game. It's
Yeah,
so
it sounds
cool.
like it. Yeah. I
Yeah.
will say, I want to put just a voice in the ring for the 2 players with like a dummy player thing, because so I played 7 Wonders at 2 players with Maya many years ago, something I would not do now. Not 7 Wonders Duel, 7 Wonders original version 2-player. And what that does is it gives you take turns controlling a third hand. So I think that this becomes a philosophical question of, do you want a specific spot on your back scratched, or do you just want to kind of scratch your back generally, right? And like that wasn't 7 Wonders, but it was close enough, and I really enjoyed drafting, so I liked it, and it gave me a new tool to see the decision space slightly differently. Was it 7 Wonders? No, it wasn't what the vast majority of other 7 Wonders is. I don't think, because I had all this other agency half the time, but it was awesome and I really enjoyed it, and it was close enough and it was really cool. I don't
So
care. It's great.
I'll now eat my words when it comes to complaining about having to run a dummy player, because I have played through most of the Crew Mission Deep Sea and
3.
Fellowship of the Ring, the trick taking game, with 2 players where you do run a dummy hand, and it's great. It's different though. So which makes me think, are you all generally okay with the game feeling vastly different at different player counts, or do you want the game to be the game no matter how many people are playing?
That's a good question. I mean, I again, it's like a question of what's the core essence of the thing, or maybe the game does feel really different at different player counts, but you just have the one that you like. Like I would probably never choose to play Santorini at 3 players. I just want to play it 2 players. That's the game that I like. Um, so I think a good example though of, like, for example, Castles of Burgundy, the card game, is built after the board game, which I guess probably has a solo variant, but the solo variant in the card game is just so simple and smooth that I really enjoy playing it that way, and almost that's the game to me. I'd rather almost just play it as a solo experience than play with other people.
And I think for me, this is a tough question, because I don't mind it. I I think it can be really interesting to see how a game changes from player count to player count and if it's different. But I think the quote, in my mind, the right decision, if the objective is to sell the most copies of your game, is to have it be as similar as possible between player counts. And those are really different things, right? Do you want a game that at like aesthetic appreciation, I don't care at all. If I'm trying to have a really popular game, I think for a host of reasons, including you want players who play the game at different player counts to be able to talk about their experience and to feel like they're talking about the same game. I think that's actually really important to cultivating popularity. So that's where I think you have publishers who are saying this needs to play accommodate 1 to 5, and it has to be as close as possible between all those player counts. How about you, Pete?
Well, I was going to say, one thing I think is funny is that I can think of at least one game where I actually prefer the 2-player variant
Mm.
to the quote full game, and that's Race for the Galaxy.
Oh, sure.
In Race for the Galaxy, in the standard game, everyone chooses 1 action to play. And then you'll take the actions everyone chose, but everyone only chooses 1. But in the 2-player game, each player chooses 2 actions. And it just really allows the engine building of the game to go a little bit faster, gives you more control. I think it's a more satisfying experience. So that's a situation actually where the variant, I think, is more fun
Yeah.
than the standard version of the game.
And Brendan, I believe you're on record saying that you like the sort of Kingdomino epic Giganto version, which is 2-player exclusive, more than what we would consider the 2 to, or maybe I guess 2 to 4 player Kingdomino game, right?
100%. Yeah, I think the 2-player version that uses all the tiles for 2 players is the strictly better version of the game for me. But that's because I love the zero-sum drafting. That interaction to me makes the little draft so much more dynamic and interesting. But yeah, you should listen to the Kingdomino episode for sure.
Another episode you've played a bajillion times at 2 players is Cascadia.
Yeah.
As I think about what I don't know if I've ever played a 2-player, but as I think about the difference is largely, is it a downtime question with more players? I mean, I think it plays 4. The expansion maybe adds it up to 6, 5 or 6. You put out a bunch of tiles, you draft them. It's not gonna take dramatically longer, but are there other differences at 2 players?
It's just a lot of downtime, like you said, Paul. And then there is a little bit of less variance in what tiles are available in the display, like which animals are paired with which terrain pieces, because fewer people are picking between your turn if it's in a 2-player game. So I can plan a little bit more, speculate a little bit more, look at my opponent's board a little bit more, think about what they're going for, and make value judgments. I This is another nitpick of mine, but I just like Cascadia so much more at 2. Mostly because I feel like I'm just doing more given the time. Whenever I played at 3 or 4, it's just like, okay, I'll go get some pretzels. I
Mhm.
you know? That's one where it's like, "Oh, could we do anything to speed this up?"
Yeah.
And I love Cascadia, right? It's just when I've played it at 2, it's sort of like, "Oh, let's play El Grande if we have 4."
Let me switch gears for a second. I wanna talk about games. We've talked about a lot of little tweaks that games make to accommodate different player counts, but there are sometimes games that naturally, built into their design, are flexible.
Mhm.
Um, we talked about Codenames. It's essentially the same core game, you just get more people on one side, but I wanna talk about 2 games here. One I've talked about before, Ink and Gold, and the other is Not Alone. In Ink and Gold, for those that may not recall, you're all sort of in the same boat or the same tunnel, should I say, of this temple you're exploring. And each turn you flip out a card, and maybe it's bad, maybe it's good. And when it's good, it's like 10 gems. And you split them up as evenly as you can, and there's leftovers on the cards. So right away, right there, there's a difference in player count. And this happens in the game, people leave the temple, and as the round progresses, the player count for the who's in the temple essentially changes. Like all 3 of us might be in, but then when Pete leaves, it's just me and Brendan, and they're splitting. So that already has a built-in difference there. But when you're splitting among 7 players, the remainders get higher, right? If you have 14 or let's just say 13 split between 2 players, you get a remain. Sorry, split between 3 players, you have a remainder of 1, and when it's split between 2 players, you each get way more, etc. What this game does to smooth that out, and I don't even know if this is like designed or it just occurs. Um, the more players you have, the bigger the remainders are on these cards, and they incentivize you to leave the temple and scoop up all those gems on your way out. So even at 7, 8 players, whatever it does, people still leave. And you get down to that same core tension inside each round of like 2, maybe 1 person trying to go it alone. And I think that's just so cool.
I think Ink and Gold's brilliant too, Paul, because the core question of that game is how much of the pie are you going to get, right? There's a certain number of points that are going to be there in the game. So whether you're playing 2 or 14 people, I don't know that it plays to 14, but it's about how much more of the pie can you get than everyone else. So that scales fairly nicely. And then it's all simultaneous choice. So it scales fairly nicely, which,
Exactly.
it's just Ink and Gold's brilliant design. Just so good.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So let me touch on this other one, which is a game called Not Alone, which was, I think, kind of popular, and no one really seems to talk about it. Pete, you're nodding your head like maybe you've played this thing.
We used to play this game a lot. I love this game.
It's very cool. So this is a one versus many
Mm.
game. The many people have crash landed on a planet, and apparently they're not alone because the one player is sort of some, I don't know, alien beast. I don't know what they're called on this thing. And the game is built on simultaneous choice. The players, there's like a location board of 8 locations or something like that, maybe 10. You have the same hand of cards that you'll play to decide which locations you go to, and you can talk as much as you want and plan, but of course everything you say the alien player can hear. So It's a bit random, really. You play a card, you flip it over, and then the alien might play a card and try to guess where you are. Okay, bit like that. Um, and the difference here is with more players, they're going to naturally be in more locations, right? And so the alien is going to catch them more often at higher player counts. But the counterpoint is that there's more of them. And so if they just spread out, more of them will get to succeed in doing the actions at these different locations. So there's this natural counterbalance where the game at two players feels, I don't know, a little sneakier. Like maybe we can all get away with it this round and pull off a little bit. And it gets down to this tense moment. With more players, it's like a little more predictable of like, well, we're going to get hit a little bit, but we're still going to make progress towards this end of the game. They do use a variable timer, and it just still really works at every player count. I think it's really fun design.
So let's get maybe a little spicy, perhaps. Are there any games that you will only play at a specific player count and give a reason? So are there any games that you're like, no, this really is just the only count I would play this game at? My example is the board Game of Thrones, which I've talked about on the show before. This is strictly a 6-player game. That's also the max player count. But just if you play with less, you're not using part of the map and it becomes really unbalanced. Some of the factions have a lot more room to breathe, whereas the other factions are still down each other's throats. So it's this rare game that only, in my mind, plays 6. I think that the old Dune area control game is also supposed to be one of these strictly 6-player games. So do you have anything like that, like a game that for you, it really just has to be played at this player count? Or am I just more, you know, persnickety?
I think we've said a couple. Santorini, we've talked about Cascadia, we've talked about Kingdomino, we've talked about um, one that accommodates a lot of players, but I really don't want to do is Unlock, which I think was my number 3 game of all time. It was, it's basically an escape room series. I want to play that at 3 players, and with 8 players or whatever it is, there's just not enough cards to go around, and so you're really squeezing your heads together to try to look at what the art is. And with 3 players, it works really well. Maybe 4 for 2 of us to be going through these cards and looking at it, and a third person to kind of do the app part of the game. And it just that's my favorite. I don't think I want to do it at anything else. Plus, I have 2 buddies I want to do it with.
If I said Babylonia was really great because it scales between 2 and 4 players, I think that's the case because one of the prime criticisms I have of Tigris and Euphrates, a game by the same designer which came out in 1999, almost 20 years before, 20 years prior, is that Tigris and Euphrates is a 4-player game that it can accommodate 2 or 3 players. In my mind, the board and just so much of the conflict at 4 players that's incentivized and the flow of that game and the pace and the arc of it is just perfect at 4 players. You can play it with 2. It's a fundamentally different experience, in my mind, much less interesting. I've played it 2, maybe 10 times. And 3 players is fine. It just feels like you can't ever find the other people in laser tag.
Now, Brendan, you and I have been playing a decent amount of Root.
Oh, man.
And for some people, Root is exclusively a 4-player game because that's the number of factions that gives you the kind of interaction you want. But one thing that they have done with the game is that they have created this add-on that came in the Marauder expansion called Hirelings.
Mhm.
And Hirelings are basically NPC factions that live on the board that essentially usually it's kind of like whoever's in last place gets to control a hireling. There's various ways that the hirelings shift in terms of who's controlling them. But that is a way that that company has specifically said, hey, this needs to play better than it does at 2 or 3. I actually think 3-player Root can be really fun if you have the right faction mix without hirelings. But I think 2 players with hirelings is it gives you some Root. I wouldn't choose to play it, but they've thought about it. And then some people even play Root up to 5 or more players, which is insane to me. But that is one where for some people it is strictly a 4-player game. I just love it enough that I'm happy to play it at almost any player count.
I think
Having only played it once, I thought 3 was probably a sweet spot. I don't that there is a substantial amount of downtime in that game.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd wanna sit there that long for 4 players. I mean, you're gonna throw in a vagabond, and that's gonna get me going? I'm not sure.
And I will say, I think Root is designed for 4 players, but Root never would have succeeded in the market the way it has if it was a 4-player game on the box. It just couldn't have. And it
That's a
this
good
is where
segue, though,
yeah, this is
to
the
talk
problem.
about advertised player counts, right? So we we've all designed games. Paul, you have been on the publishing side specifically.
Yep.
Do or would you put a player count on a box that is not ideal but it works?
Okay, this is a good question, and I will tell you I am wrestling with this right now on a game that I am localizing. It's an amazing deduction game called Orapa Mine, and Orapa Mine is basically like if Battleship was good. We each have a hidden thing with these blocks on there, and we're trying to find the location of each other's blocks, and we're doing it by sending in these ultrasonic pings, and they bounce around and change colors and stuff. It's very, very cool. But it's really built as a two-player game. And there's like a 3 to 5 player variant, which is sort of like we all take turns and try to solve the same puzzle, and but we all get the same information essentially all the time. And so that's a little awkward. It's just sort of like who can solve this puzzle the best, even though we all had the same information. And what they did, this is from Playti Games. I don't think I've ever seen this before. Is on the box it says 2 to 5, but the 2 is like bigger and bold. So it's like they're telling you this is a 2-player game with a 5, with up to 5 as a variant. And so I've considered just doing a 2-player game. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's probably less good at 5 players, right? It's probably less good at 3 or 4 or 5, but um, there are probably people out there that they just wanna have it for that, and so you go,
Yeah.
"Okay." Right? And Foolish Fool, a party game I've just published, the player count's 3 to 8. You could play a 2-player and just flip out these cards and just back and forth goof it out, right? You could, Pete, you've played it,
That would be
and,
wild.
I've certainly demoed it at 2 players a lot, but that's I didn't put that on the box.
I think that for me, the big thing in here is who oftentimes people aren't gonna be frustrated that you gave them the choice to do something, and then if they do it, then they can choose not to do it again. But they might never buy the thing if you don't give them the choice to do something they don't wanna do, right? The perceived value of having the option to do something you never do is so much greater than being faced with the reality that what you're buying is the limited experience that you will only ever have with it. So psychologically, I think it's so incredibly hard to justify not putting a player count on the box if it's functional
Mhm.
because every other incentive is there. What someone shouldn't do is if it's absolutely horrible and it will damage the reputation of you as a designer or of you as a publisher. If someone's going to play something and say that didn't work and was a waste of my time, you don't want to waste anyone's time. You want to at least be in the oh, this was not ideal. I see what they're going for, and then let the player decide, right? And this part of this also is that it's a matter of taste. There's going to be
Yes.
someone out there, Paul, who if you publish that game with the 3 to 5, there's going to be a group of 5 people who decide that's their favorite game. Right? It's
Right,
just some
right.
group where that works for them. That's what they want. They're playing it in a vacuum and it's awesome. And if you don't put it on the box, it'll never happen. And
Yeah,
even though to the rest of the world, they could be like, that sucks. Don't do that. You can't invalidate that experience.
yeah, this is such a big thing for me in the publishing world and the design world is like I just had this argument with someone at Origins where I was saying that For Sale Autorama is the version of For Sale that I would recommend to people because it is for sale with cars. You can play the base game and there's extra that you can play if you want to. And they were
Yeah.
saying absolutely not because I believe that if you play with that stuff, it's a worse version of the game and definitely don't give it to them.
Mm.
And when Santa's Workshop came out and was reviewed by the Dice Tower, the board has 2 sides. It has an advanced side, which is kind of the original game as published in the first edition, and then the family side, essentially, which is similar but lighter. And Tom Vasel just said, I wish that this side of the board didn't exist. And for whatever reason, that was his opinion. My opinion is that that's the better side of the board, and the product is definitely better with both.
Yeah.
Though I've been in talks to maybe make two separate products, and there's no right answers to this kind of question. Like you said, there's really no accounting for taste and what people will like or accept. Another example of this is like Queen games come out with like 10 Queenies in them. And Queenies are like mini expansions that you can put in or not put in. And I do that. We have two of them in the No Loose Ends rulebook. Some people just don't like that. They just say, give me the best version of the game and I'll play it. But all of us know that that's not a real thing. There is no best version of the game. There is what the designer intends. There's what the developer and the publisher decides and offers. And then there's what the player enjoys or doesn't. And there's a million little choices to negotiate along the way.
And I think a huge part of what that comes down to too becomes a decision space of its own of, is this worth my time as a developer, as a designer, as a publisher to put in at trying to make this game go to 5? Is it a good use of my time in terms of development it would need? Is it a good use of my time in terms of the cost? Is the sort of payoff? With Honey Buzz Ball, that was a great example. Y'all made the decision that it should be a 4-player game because it wasn't as economically sensible, given that people probably wouldn't play it there and it wasn't necessarily the best, even though you knew it could work there and you play tested it at 6. And I think the flip side is something like Enchanted Plumes, which is one of my games that I actually, that game is published. It says it goes 2 to 6. I would never play Enchanted Plumes at 6. I don't think it should be played there. And I think for marketing reasons, the publisher felt like they needed to. I'll also say it's pretty good at 5. I think it's fine at 4. I think it's better at 2 and 3. Like I would prefer to play it at 2 or 3. And I like Enchanted Plumes so much. I spent a lot of time after it was published to make a 1-player variant that people blog about on BGG still, because it turns out that was the sweet spot for the game. So for me, that was a good use of my time after the game had already been published, being a loon and putting it on Board Game Geek. And I'd love to have it be in the official box someday,
Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts on this. One thing is to go back to No Loose Ends because Paul and I didn't make really any changes to the core gameplay of Shut the Books, which is the original game by Taiki Shinzawa. But that game that came out in Japan is listed as a 3 to 4 player game. And we were just like, what's this like to play with 2 or 5? And we did it and we were like, this totally works, right?
Yep.
It's different, right? It's not giving you the same experience that Shinzawa's 3 to 4 player count was. But if you have 5 people and you really wanted to play Shut the Books, you can, right?
Yeah.
And so that was, we decided that like it was good enough that like if someone wants to play it with 5, tell them how, right?
Yeah.
Because I think 5 is this weird player count that you want games to play to. I've talked to Jamie about this because if you have 5 people show up to game night, you need to all play the same game. If you have 6 people show up to game night, you could theoretically split off and play 2 3-player games.
Not only could you should.
You should perhaps, right. But 5 is one of those odd player counts that if you really wanted to play a game and you were set on playing that game with no matter how many people show up at your game night, 5 is kind of that magic number. And so I think that's why Stonemaier sometimes gets knocked for maybe their games being too long at 5. I remember some people complained about that with Expeditions, but it's like he's just telling people if you really want to play this with 5,
you can do it.
You can.
Yeah, exactly. And 5's also kind of the edge of party game territory. And so some party games are not as good at 5 as they are at 10 or something. Something Brendan said that just reminded me, so for example, Trinket Trove is listed as a 2 to 6 player game, but there are 8 player components in the game. And so right away, I think it will be obvious to players that they could play at 8 players and it will work. It will totally be that game at 8 players, but we didn't put it on the box. And I don't even think we tested it. We just thought like, I don't know, it's going to be longer. You're going to get less stuff, etc. Because there's no deck adjustments for different player counts, just game length stuff. One other example is Honey Buzz. We talked about how it's a 4-player game. People have requested so much a 5th player expansion. And we've spent time developing what it will require, more stuff here, more nectar, a new type of nectar, whatever. Um, but we also sold a fall color player pack. So you can buy 4 new player color sets. So if you want, you and your friends can play Honey Buzz at 8 players right now. If you buy that stuff, you can certainly play it at 5 players, and it's been tested at 6 and so on. But it's just a question of knowing the fact that, you're just going to get to do less. You're going to get less nectar. You're going to be able to sell less. You're going to have to narrow your strategy down more on like what precisely am I going to do in the few turns that I have. If that's fine with you, then go for it. You might love that. It might feel better to you to have this more scarce, more competitive version of the game. But maybe for most, that's not the game a publisher wants to put out.
So, how do we want to end this? What's kind of like our? I think we're kind of winding down, perhaps. So, maybe let's talk about at the end here, for people looking to design games, what kind of maybe challenges they should expect to come across when it comes to player count, and how they should decide maybe what player count they should say that their game plays to.
Yeah, I think this is similar to the question of designing a solo variant for a game. You need to identify what is the core interactions of this game. What is the heart of the way that players interact and the effect of having more players doing the interaction has on the game. And if there's no player interaction and it's a roll and write, then you can just play it solo and give them a chart for their score, and it's fine enough. No one's really worried about it. But if it's Trinket Trove or it's Viticulture or it's something else, you can identify these are the specific places that the interactions take place. There may be tweaks that you can make to ensure that it happens well at all player counts, right? You just need to know what your game is first before you try to make it the same across player counts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a good way to think about that too, if you're struggling with that idea, is how many decisions do I get to make and how much do I feel like I affected the game? If you're sitting down and thinking about a design, right? At a given player count, how much are those things true? And then add on, how much of the game do I get to have that's mine, right? That's the dividing the nectar and honey buzz. How much of the nectar do I get to grab? That's cards and enchanted plumes. How many of those do I get to collect and make part of my plumes? Those are really good places to start. And then I think a lot of this comes down to then if you're trying to optimize, if it's a pitching consideration, you should try to pitch broader. No one's going to say, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't have pitched a game that played 1 to 5 players." No one will say that to you. They will say, "Oh, how does this actually work at 5? Do you think it's good at 5? Would you recommend this at 5? What's the cost of us getting this to 5?" Those sort of things, right? Is the one player version actually good? Be in that space rather than being in the, "Oh, so I know this works really great at 2 or 3 players. I think it will work at 4, and I haven't tested it at 5." Don't be there. You just do the little bit of extra work to get yourself there, so then the publisher can make the decision on the other end. Or if you're at, "This could play 2 or 3, I don't think I can push higher," you have a choice to make. Is it a 2-player game or is it a 3-player game? Because the market really would like it to be a 2-player game. Or if you think you've designed the greatest 3-player game of all time, there are games that have attempted it, but that is now the identity of your game. You designed a 3-player game and you're looking for a publisher who will publish a 3-player game, and your theme should justify it. And you need to lean into all of that.
I just want to ask one real quick question. We've talked about how much of the game do you get to do? How many turns do you get to do? And listeners of the show will know that that's some of the language I've used in my complaints about El Grande. I just want to know what's the best player count for El Grande.
4 or 5.
I like it
Brendan?
at 3, but I know that the popular opinion is more, but I think it plays fine at 3.
Does it play two?
Area
Straight up
control at
no?
2 is tricky, but do I
I'm
have a
just asking
design
if
for
it's in the
you?
rules.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's in the rules.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Should I not pitch you live? Okay.
Yeah, I think that, how many players a game plays is really going to be very group dependent. Some people are only going to want to play a game at what they view as the optimal player count, and that's totally fine for them. I think that some of us are a little bit more flexible when it comes to that. And, come to our Discord and tell us if you think we're totally wrong about any of this stuff. There'll be a link to the Discord in the show notes. You can say, hey, you guys are wrong. You should not put a suboptimal player count on a box, or, you guys are wrong on whatever we said. We love to discuss all that stuff.
And hey, come on there and let us know on the Discord, what is the ideal player count for El Grande, and why is it 0? Join us. Thanks always to our patrons. You can join on Patreon, decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon, excuse me. Follow us on Twitter and Board Game Geek. We love all of you, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. And thanks always to Hembry for our intro-outro song, Reach Out. Bye-bye.
Bye.